Thank you very much for our esteemed panelists joining us on stage. And I was blessed and privileged to have a group of fiscal experts up here earlier, and now we have people that really understand what goes on in our political landscape, our elections landscape. And obviously, we're at a unique time in New Jersey. We just had a pretty consequential election just a few weeks ago, and now we know 2024, the entire nation has a pretty consequential election coming up. And in 2025, which is crazy that you're 2 years out, but we're already thinking about it, is who's going to be the next governor of New Jersey? Because we know Governor Murphy is term limited out and can't be. So we have four fantastic people up here that you probably have seen or heard from before to talk politics with us for a little bit and warm us up before the governor walks in at 11. So with that, their intros are online and you can go check them out. I'm going to just, as I ask them questions, I'm going to just introduce them a little bit. So first up, we have, I'll just say, Jeanette from Marathon Public Affairs, Alex Zdan, formerly of News 12, fantastic political reporter, Jay Red, Stonewall Public Affairs, and Ben Dworkin of Roman University will be with us for the next 40 minutes or so. So first one to start with Ben and Alex from the academic and journalist perspective. It seems from a lot of perspectives that Republicans did not have a great night on election night in the state legislature. From a more objective perspective, can you talk about what you saw on election night this past first Tuesday in November and why it happened? So I guess we can start with Ben here at the end.
Okay. First of all, thank you for hosting and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, it was a rough night for Republicans, and it was a rough night because expectations were not met at all. Republicans fully expected, and Republican leadership would tell people who were at events, were saying, there will be more Republicans in the legislature come January than there are today. And they went back. I mean, it wasn't even, they didn't even stay even. And so it was a very disappointing night for Republicans. And I think these expectations can really be understood if we look at four things, factors, dynamics that framed this election. First of all, this was an election after redistricting. The redistricting, in theory, was supposed to help Republicans. Certain districts that were going to be competitive got a little bit more Republican. Second factor that shaped these expectations, it's the 6th year of a Democratic administration. And historically, everybody who gets these two-term governors, the 6th-year election, as this was for the Murphy administration, this is when the governor's party loses seats. Third, it was a low turnout year, which meant that the Democratic numerical superiority when it comes to voter registration was not going to have the impact it does, say, in a presidential year when we have 70% turnout. This year, I think we'll end up in the 23-24% range in terms of turnout of registered voters. And so you thought, well, Republicans, yeah, they're outnumbered, but if no one's showing up, then that majority doesn't make as much of a difference. And finally, what shaped those expectations were these hot issues that percolated over the last year. And those issues all seemed to favor the GOP. Dead whales, gas stoves, schools and parents. All of these things were things that people in this room, a lot of people we talked to were talking about. So you can't fault the GOP leadership for thinking that this was going to be a good year. We're going to pick up seats, maybe not enough to get the majority, but to head towards a gubernatorial year in 2025 to get that much closer. And obviously, that didn't happen. So to use the word of the day, notwithstanding anything I'm about to tell you, let me just say, just from an academic perspective, there is more data to come, and we will know more about this race in a couple months, simply because the voter file that tells us who actually voted, once that is overlaid with all of the identifying markers that we have for different kinds of voters, we'll have a better sense of who showed up and why. So just as an example, you go back to previous elections, after we had the voter file, we saw that young women showed up in bigger numbers in the post-Dodd's elections. Well, that gave some indication about how we interpret what happened in these elections. So we will have that eventually here. Now, that having been said, I think there are three things that we can say at this point pretty clearly shaped the way the elections and made them come out the way they did. Money. Now, Democrats always have more money than Republicans. They've been in the majority for 20 years. It's a whole lot easier to raise a lot of money. It matters more this year in 2023 because there was no statewide election, no national election to offset the money, to reframe the debate because people are arguing about who's running for governor. There was just these local races, effectively. And so when you have that kind of monetary superiority in terms of being able to outspend in some of these contested districts, 4-1, 5-1, 6-1, what the Democrats were able to do, it had a much bigger impact. Second reason I think we saw the results we did, issues. The hot issues didn't overcome, clearly, the what I like to call the AA battery that the Democrats had, which was abortion and affordability. Abortion being about 80% of their message, and affordability and talking about anchor and stay NJ being the second part of it. So of abortion, Democrats had their own wedge issue. Clearly, and we see this across the nation, it continues to be a highly motivating factor for a lot of people. And so it's not surprising that the Democrats ran with it as hard as they did. A lot of us thought, well, you know, it's safe here. We're not places where it's really under threat. It still motivates people, and that was clear with this. The other part of the Democratic message that won out was this notion of affordability. Now, we could all talk about whether you think Stay NJ is a gimmick or not, and whether anchor is really going to be sustainable and helpful or not. But the Eagleton poll that came out in the final day of the campaign that talked about it said, we've asked voters in the last week what they were concerned about, and they were concerned about affordability. They were concerned about pocketbook issues. And in the end, there was one party that was really making that part of their message. And perhaps ironically, it was the Democrats, because Republicans have been running on that forever. So why haven't they been able to use that affordability issue to make a difference for them? Well, there are probably a lot of different factors, but what was clear here was that while there were some who were going to vote about stoves and dead whales and any number of those and parents in schools, it wasn't going to be enough. Final thing. So it was money, there were issues, and the final thing that I'd like to say or suggest for why we saw what we saw were tactics. The fact is, the vote by mail program that the Democrats have implemented is a real problem for the Republican Party in this state. Let me point about how just in a presidential campaign, every 4 years, one party somehow emerges with the new technology, right? Back in the Obama days, it was, wow, they discovered internet fundraising. Or then we discovered big data. And it takes about 4 years for the other party to catch up. They say, we lost this race, what do we have to do? They invest heavily in it, and then the parties are equal, and somebody comes up with some new idea, and that's what happens. You can't do that with VBMs. This is not just a technology, this is a voter behavior situation. So every year that the Democrats continue to get their hardcore folks used to voting and accustomed to voting by VBM, it just makes their lead in terms of this process that much stronger. And Republicans, the Republican leadership gets it, the Republican consulting class gets it, the Republican base is hesitant for any number of reasons, not the least of which bad sort of talk about concerns about whether it's trustworthy that were really highlighted by the former president. And so you have this situation where Democrats are getting voters more and more used to this particular aggressive tactic of securing votes, of banking them early. And you have the Republicans trying to catch up, and it's hard. It'll come, and I don't know whether they'll ever will, because it's not just, oh, if we spend $10 million, we're gonna somehow catch up on this technology. The other thing to note about the VBMs, look, aside from the fact that if you've got to get 20,000 people in a district to come out to vote, and you can get 10 of them to do it 3 weeks out, then you only have 10,000 to focus your remaining resources. That's a huge tactical advantage, as opposed to saying, oh, we got to get 20,000 people, and they all have to show up over 14 hours on one day on a Tuesday. So no one better be sick, and better not rain, and it better not be inconvenient for anybody, or else we can't get the 20,000. That's the obvious advantage. The second thing, and again, the Democrats are beginning to do this now that they're getting their voters used to coming out, is that it changes the electorate. As we know, people could look and say, well, who's going to show up in a legislative-only election here? And you can see, well, who showed up in 2019 when it was just the state legislature? You can identify, you know there are people who you can see, well, they vote in presidential years and they only vote in presidential years. What VBMs allow you to do, and what the Democrats did quite successfully in some of their targeted districts, is that they were able to get non-likely voters to actually vote this year, their people. And so you had upwards of about 4,000 registered Democrats committed, who the party identified as their voters, who did not vote in 2019, cast ballots in one of the highly contested districts in Legislative District 3, the Durr-Berzicelli race. And so you've created a new electorate because you found these other folks and you were able to get them because that mail-in ballot was sitting on their mantle. So it's a tactical advantage, and it's a real challenge to see where where the Republicans are going to be able to catch up on this one, because it's a time thing. The longer it goes on, Democrats are going to get their folks even more used to it. They're going to get more sophisticated at it, and Republicans are definitely trying to catch up, but it's going to be tough. So there.
Thank you, Ben, for the great insights. Alex, you're one of my favorite reporters because you ask tough questions. What's your tough take on what happened on election night?
It's not very complicated. Republicans wanted to win seats. They didn't. Democrats had a better messaging apparatus than the Republicans did. And like Ben said, you had one very strong message on the Democratic side, abortion. And the Republicans had 5 or 6 maybe, gas stoves, whales, sex ed curriculum. And that did not move enough people to the polling place, as did the Democratic message of abortion. And I feel like one of those NFL coaches at a halftime press conference. The object of the game is to put more points on the board. The object of the game is to get more voters out to vote for your people. The Democrats had the better message. Republicans were not able to capitalize on what could have been very favorable wins that could have caused them to pick up or at least hold some of these seats.
Thank you, Alex. Jay, from your perspective, why did the Democrats do so well?
I think that Dr. Dworkin pretty much summed it up in terms of kind of his analysis, looking at the racism, looking at the strategy from the Democratic side and on the Republican side. But I'll take it a step further, and with that, without having kind of like somebody like the governor or senator at the top of the ticket, the Democrats were really able to focus on candidate selection in those real specific races. So if you look at District 3, which is a district that is close to my heart, working for the former Senate president, that was something where they were able to put Berzicelli and I forget Dave, and I forget his last name, but they were able to put folks in there and in that seat that really spoke to the district and really had a really good ground game to connect with the voters. So they didn't have to worry about kind of the national issues, and they were able to run kind of focused races which focused on issues that were really important to the areas and really say, hey, these guys are you, they're from the district, and really did a good job on that point. The other thing too is and Dr. Dworkin mentioned it with the vote by mail and the early voting, and then also kind of the chasing of the early voting or the vote by mail where it's like, I like to vote on election day, even though, certain folks will always give me grief, like Kevin Drennan will always get mad at me because he's like, you don't vote on election day, but I like to vote on election day. But the number of calls that I received from various sorts and mail saying, hey, you haven't voted yet. We know you're a 4-4 voter, but you haven't come out. The chase was on. So I knew that day I had to get that vote in, and I think that it's just that really does turn out numbers because folks are kind of just like, all right, enough. And there's more than enough opportunities for you to get out there and really do it. I do say that, leading into it, the party kind of recognized the key pocketbook issues that they were going to focus on. Perano and his team with the state party, with the chairman, were really focused on talking to voters, really figuring out what those issues are and kind of just making sure to hit that message. But even with that, and even with the internal polling that we saw and things like that, and with the candidates, we were nervous up until after the polls closed. Even though things looked really good, we were still nervous because we still have kind of the recollection of 2 years ago when we thought everything was good, and it turned out that it wasn't. So I think that folks were really nervous, and they really, I guess, going with the sports references, really ran out the tape and really ran out, ran the race out or ran to first and kept going just to make sure that there was no room for error on this, and we left everything on the field.
Thank you, Jay. Jeanette, what's your take on why Republicans underperformed from expectations, and were those expectations realistic? What do you think?
Well, I'm glad I have the opportunity to go last here. And also, I was live on News 12 election night for 4 hours from 8 p.m. to 12 a.m. trying to explain away these losses. So I'll accept everyone's condolences right now. But so yeah, expectations were pretty high just because of what we've seen in the polling. And I think the mistake that Republicans made, or the mistake in the narrative right now, is that this was a statewide campaign. This was not a statewide campaign. These were all local, individual legislative campaigns, slightly bigger than a county campaign. There was no Jack Ciattarelli at the top of the ticket. There was no Phil Murphy at the top of the ticket bringing people out to vote. So when you look at it, you look at District 3, where you had John Berzicelli versus Ed Durr. I will tell you, that district, I don't think Ed Durr was the best candidate, frankly, and I think candidate recruitment played a very big role in a lot of these districts. There were only 3 or 4 competitive districts in the entire state of New Jersey. Out of 4 legislative districts, only 3 or 4 were competitive. So it's not like this massive Democratic landslide in New Jersey. 3 or 4 competitive districts, and I will say the Democrats ran really effective candidates in each and every one of those competitive districts. John Berzicelli, former assemblyman. Paul Moriarty, former assemblyman, former newscaster in Philadelphia, very popular. He knows the needs of his constituents. Joe Lagana, a senator in Bergen County. He's the incumbent. His opponent didn't have much name ID. And all of these, top of the ticket senators, assemblymen, and those targeted districts that were Democrats, they staked out their independence from Governor Murphy. They came out against the EV mandate. In fact, John Berzicelli was the first person to testify against Governor Murphy's EV mandate to the DEP. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention Vingo Powell. How could I forget Vingo Powell? Yeah. Vingo Powell, he's my senator in that district. I think he's one of the most highly effective campaigners I've ever seen in the state legislature. He has staked out his independence from Governor Murphy to represent his district in Monmouth County, which is a swing district, but oftentimes Monmouth County can be the most Republican district in the entire state. He's an excellent candidate, and the Republicans ran someone against him who's never run for office before and had hardly any name ID, and Vingo Powell raised $6 million, setting a record in legislative history for a campaign. So when you look at it, it's, you can say, oh, Republicans, they had a terrible message. But no, Democrats did a great job of running local campaigns, recruiting great candidates who were reflective of the districts that they were running in. So I'll say that right there. I also say, if Jack Ciattarelli and Phil Murphy were at the top of the ticket, I think we would be talking about a very different election night. If it was 2024 and Trump were at the top of the ticket, that would also be a different story. But we'll talk about that later. Going back to what Ben and Jay said, the numbers of vote by mail and early voting, the Democrats have mastered that. When you're looking at an election that has only 22 to 23% turnout, the vast majority of people are not voting, and Democrats were able to turn their general election, gubernatorial, and presidential election voters into every year voters. That makes a huge, huge difference. The fact of the matter is, on election day, Vingo Powell was ahead by 8,000 vote-by-mail ballots. 8,000 just going into election day. He only won by, I think, 12,000. So, I mean, that's a really huge disadvantage for Republicans. We have to get better at mastering the techniques of vote by mail and early voting. And I know a lot of Republicans like to bemoan this and it's anti-democratic and I just want to vote on election day and know the results that night. Well, guess what? These are the ground rules right now. These are the rules of the game. And until we have a Republican governor, we can't get rid of them. So we got to win first. I've seen so much mail and you know, I don't know if you're like every other household where you got like 50 mail pieces in 2 weeks and half the time you don't even know which candidate they're for, Republican or a Democrat. Throw out half the mail and get a great vote-by-mail program. I mean, I think that's my message for the takeaway. Because in the end, it is, as Alex said, it's if you want to get your people out to vote. It's right. It's a numbers game. It's about getting the most amount of voters out on election day. And Democrats have mastered that technique, and Republicans are far behind. I don't look at it as a problem for Republicans. I look at it as an opportunity. And then I'll touch briefly into the messaging because I don't think it was that big of a problem. I think Republicans could have talked more on affordability. I think Democrats did a great job with Stay New Jersey, specifically because they talked to seniors who come out more than any other population. Republicans didn't do that as much. Parental rights is a big issue, but I think affordability definitely always tops it. Abortion, we have a problem with abortion in New Jersey as Republicans. We need to do a better job communicating that. I live in District 11. The 2 Republican assemblywomen are as pro-choice as they come, and I saw them painted as not, as denying a woman's right to choose. So that's an issue that Republicans are going to have to grapple with. But you know, in the end, these were about local campaigns, and I'll just, before I end on a negative note, I want to just talk about some positive campaigns. In Westfield, we took Republican control. In Summit, we took Republican control. Cumberland County, Mike Testa, as the chairman, and he's also a state senator, did a great job of implementing vote by mail, taking control of the Cumberland County Commissioner Board, and really bringing in new people to the Republican Party by communicating in Spanish and getting Spanish flyers out there and bringing new people into the party. That's another thing Republicans have to do better, bringing new people into the party when we have a voter disadvantage of about 1 million voters. So there were some bright spots to look at. It's not all negative.
Thank you, Jeanette. Quickly, before we move from 23, just one question, it's a personal and professional one, is BIA obviously is a policy organization. Now, this is the Public Policy Forum, and you guys touched upon policies and messaging. One of my disappointments, personally and professionally, was the amount of attention focused on social issues, social. I don't think we've seen an election like that, especially from Republicans, as it's brought up. Do you guys see that as a permanent shift, that we're moving towards more of the social wedge issues rather than talking about affordability, which everyone in this room, every family in New Jersey cares about affordability. Not everyone cares about some of those things. Do you see that social versus fiscal, financial, tax, affordability issues? Where do you see that dynamic going in the future? And anybody can take that.
Well, I think if it worked for the Democrats, you're going to see the Democrats continuing to do it, and maybe the Republicans will go back to it. You're always going to have social issues sprinkled into every election, especially in our social media age where a small quadrant of the voting populace can be marked out, tagged, literally geo-fenced on Facebook. So those are going to be a factor, especially if the next election is Trump versus Biden. That's what Trump does. That's what he stokes. So I think there will be social issues. There always are. But here in New Jersey, people have to come back to talking about affordability. They have to. Both parties will need to, because it's such a big issue.
Thanks, Alex. Ben?
Yeah, I think another word, besides notwithstanding, that we should be focused on is stability. And the fact is that when there's stability in the social sector, this is what history basically tells us, when there's stability in the social sector, then people are focused on their fiscal issues. But because of micro-targeting and because people are reading and hearing things and being targeted with certain messages, if you feel your kids are being indoctrinated, if you feel your fundamental rights are under threat, if you think the next president is going to be an authoritarian, either for the left or for the right, then it's hard to worry about the corporate business tax. It's just, I mean, people in this room, because of your obligations in the business community, you focus on it. But when there is instability that is both real and being sowed and being exploited by folks in the political process, then it's harder to talk about it. So I think it's gonna be there. You know, we like to think of New Jersey, we're different. I mean, I teach classes, oh, we're different from everybody else, but we're not an island. And we are affected by the turmoil that we see around the country and the divisions we see around the country. So it's gonna be a balance. I mean, fiscal issues, I think Alex is absolutely right. Fiscal issues are always gonna be there. But are they gonna be the thing that makes somebody vote one way or the other? That's gonna be a bit of a balance in this kind of America that we live in right now.
But I think, Ben, you're also focusing on the people like us who are plugged in, wired in, and there's always gonna be those people on the fringe. But how many people did I talk to just randomly running into people the week before the election that didn't even know there was an election in November, didn't even know what the stakes are? I feel for those voters. Other people might look down on them as people who aren't as focused, but they're focused on paying the utility bill. They're focused on paying the rent bill and making sure their house doesn't get foreclosed on. Affordability issues and fiscal issues will always, always, always be relevant to a large number of voters that both parties take for granted.
And I agree with you, Alex. I'll just chime in on that. I always feel New Jersey is a purple state. We're not red, we're not blue. We're not too extreme in either way. So when, you know, the left goes too far or the right goes too far, I think voters instinctively want to pull back to the middle. And I think that's also where both parties have issues in the primary cycles, where, you know, the right wants to drag its candidates further out to the right and the left wants to drag its candidates further out to the liberal side. So, you know, we go back and forth between Democratic governors and Republican governors, and I think we're always going to be that way.
I think and I look out the audience and I see Skip, and I know that this is something that Skip dealt with the caucus and what we dealt with the Senate president, but I think that this wins by the Democrats should not be seen as kind of a mandate to go far left. I think you have to be, I mean, because if you do that, then you risk not having that majority, you know, in 2 years. So I think that they need to kind of evaluate what's in the caucus and look at policies, and I think that the fiscal issues that you talk about, Chris, that are important to BIA and in the business community needs to be a part of that discussion. And I think we've got folks in the leadership spots that will take it and look at it that way. But I think that you can't look at the wins that we've had this year as Democrats and say, okay, well then we can do everything. Because I think we can't. I think we need to be very judicious in what we do and come up with an agenda that kind of supports the whole caucus while not alienating kind of the rest of the state or alienating the business community or creating a kind of a climate which, you know, leads to, you know, businesses leaving or leads to other things where then the pocketbook issues then become center stage, and those issues are center stage because folks are like, hey, wait a minute, why am I not enjoying the high quality of life that I expect here in New Jersey?
Great points, Jay. Thank you. Moving from a low turnout election to what next year, 2024, will be the high turnout election that we were comparing it to. Obviously, presidential election is something that'll get all the attention, but usually president is, there's a chance it could turn out to be a rematch, the same old, same old. Whether or not that's a good thing or bad thing, I'm not going to get into, but U.S. Senate race next year could be very, very different for New Jersey and something we haven't seen in quite some time. So throwing the two together, because I know we spent a lot of time on 23, which is important, who wants to jump into thoughts on what the presidential race means for New Jersey and then what that U.S. Senate race could turn out to be? Jeanette, you want to start?
Well, it's interesting. New Jersey Republicans didn't do so well with Trump at the top of the ticket, and neither did some other swing states. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, look, right now he is the front runner, but Nikki Haley is surging. So it will be interesting to see going into Iowa what happens there. Do the other candidates drop out? There's a lot of big money, Wall Street money behind Nikki Haley right now. We'll see. It's a long shot, and it still looks like Trump might be the presumptive nominee for Republicans. And I'll just be honest, that doesn't look good for Republicans on the down ballot. We also have the U.S. Senate seat with Bob Menendez digging in and saying he's going to run with 3% of support in the polls. So that should be interesting.
Come on,
Come
Jeanette.
on, I know, I forgot. I didn't.
He's still got his family on his
He's
side.
got his family members.
He still has staff. they're being paid. So gotta count.
But he knows where the bodies are buried in Hudson County, so we'll see how that
Let's
turns out.
exhume them, that's what I say.
And then the Democrats are in a fight to decide between who's going to be their nominee, the First Lady Tammy
Yes,
Murphy,
I wonder who that nominee will be.
or Congressman Andy Kim. And I'm just interested to see how that whole dynamic plays out. There'll be an open congressional seat in Congressman Kim, who's going to be the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate. It's always interesting in New Jersey because it's always musical chairs, right? No one wants to be in Congress too long in New Jersey. It's a thankless job. You're raising money every 2 years. People are fighting you in the hallways and checking you in the kidneys and things like that. So we'll have to see how that pans out. It's a crystal ball that I can't tell the answer to right now.
I think I hear people who are not in this world who are talking to me about the upcoming Senate primary between the First Lady and Senator and Congressman Kim and whoever else decides to enter into that debate. I think that because of kind of the indictment and all the news surrounding that, plus the race, it's really kind of cast a spotlight on it that we usually don't see, and it's usually something that really doesn't catch people's attention. So a lot of people are engaged now, whether they're pro because of they support some of the initiatives that the First Lady has championed, or they support Congressman Kim, or they hate the line. I think you're going to see kind of an increased turnout for the primary, just because folks are interested now, and I don't see that kind of interest in the race kind of tamping down. I do think that it's definitely tough. I think the First Lady has kind of assembled a formidable group of support for her in this, which could be daunting to the congressman. But I mean, where were we? I guess was it 6 years ago, where we said that Congressman Kim is never going to beat Congressman MacArthur because of money, and he just kind of shoe leather hit the ground. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be a very interesting race. And I talked with the congressman in Atlantic City because it seemed like at every event that I was at, and he was running around with his backpack trying to get out there. So it's going to be a spirited campaign, and he's going to throw his all into it. And the First Lady is a fighter in her own right. So we'll see how that goes.
Alex, you want to? Okay.
Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, no, I'm just making sure. Look, I think this, on the presidential side, I think we absolutely have to expect that it's going to be a rematch right now. It is. Nikki Haley is surging, and she is 40 points behind. So that's tough.
Anything can happen, Ben, okay?
Yes, and God, that's why I have a job.
No one's actually
That's
voted
great.
yet. That's part of it, too.
But look, I think on the Senate race here in New Jersey, it's a tough race for any Republican. It's a presidential year. The Democratic nominee is widely expected to win with 12 to 14%. You're going to have 70% turnout, which means that the Democratic numerical majority or lead in registered voter registration and identification is going to come to 4. So it's going to be tough. And the two people that the Republicans Party has been talking about as potential candidates, Mayor Christine Serrano-Glassner from Mendham and even Congressman Jeff Van Drew, are both in their own ways pretty well tied to the Trump world. And as Trump has not been the best party standard for Republicans in New Jersey. And that's tough. And that makes it an even more uphill battle. On the Democratic side, obviously Tammy Murphy has truly locked in the organizational support, the all-important line, the preferred ballot position in the primary. That'll help. She will certainly have a significant advantage when it comes to money. But Andy Kim continues to surprise people. You look at the guy, you meet the guy, no one expects him to sort of pull these things out, and yet he does. And so there's always something there. Let me just point out two things. One, I think the Murphy campaign has to be worried about, and I'm old enough to remember, the Brendan Byrne Arena. You talk about Brendan Byrne was leaving, and commission decided to name the new arena that they had built in what was in the Meadowlands, the Brendan Byrne Arena. And when Tom Kean writes his autobiography and talks about walking around the state, he says that's what voters knew. They just felt it was unseemly. They didn't like it. You could have that effect. This whole thing could backfire on the Murphy folks. And it's, now, doesn't mean that Tammy Murphy isn't qualified, doesn't mean that she won't, she's gonna now be on her own as a candidate. And it's unclear whether Andy Kim, will be able to pull it off. But could that dynamic, a sort of reaction, even for people who don't understand what the line is, just sort of find it a little awkward that a sitting governor is not even outgoing, right? He's got 2 more years. And his spouse is now the presumed favorite. There could be a reaction against that. And let me just throw one last thing out about the line. In 2017, when we had several people on the Democratic side running for governor, Phil Murphy won the nomination, won for the Democratic Party to run for governor with 44% of the vote. He had virtually every line in the estate. Nobody else, Wisniewski, Jim Johnson, these guys didn't get, no one got more than 22% of the vote. But when you win with 44%, what you're saying effectively is that 56% of the people were ready to vote for somebody off the line. So for those who think the line can't be beaten, that is the perhaps potential there. It helps to have the line, no one should turn it down if you get it. But it's not impossible. And we'll have to see how all this plays out.
Quickly shifting, because the governor might be coming in any second, but one to 2025, almost a lightning round. If you had to guess today, 2 years out, if you can think what that November 2025 race will be, the Republican candidate versus Democratic candidate, what it'll be, and we'll start with Ben, go down the line.
Oh,
and the
God.
governor's gonna
I gotta talk to
You're on
these
the hot
people.
seat, Ben.
There will be a Democrat and there'll be a Republican. What do you want from me?
Just go really obscure. Ben.
Okay.
Don't count out Andy Kim.
Look, I think if you had to look and play favorites right now at this moment, that's a whole giant notwithstanding caveat, right? I think Jack Ciattarelli has better name recognition and an organization in place that he's been running for 4 years, he's been running for 10 years at this point. And so on the Republican side, I think you'd have to consider him the favorite. The Democrats are doing this thing that they always do, which is sort of the dance before the dance. If we remember from 6 years ago, there was Murphy, there was Sweeney, there was Fulop, and then Sweeney and Fulop ended up not even being on the ballot. So there are a lot of people who are putting their name out there on the Democratic side. I am not sure who really ends up being it. That's something the party's gonna have to figure out, but it's too early to say. There are a lot of people who think they have a path to victory. It's not clear which one is gonna come out just yet.
Thank you, Ben. Jay?
Wow, I agree. I think someone mentioned Ciattarelli, probably on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, I think that it's too open. But I would say that, don't count out my former boss, the Senate President Steve Sweeney, because I think he's looking at it and he's interested, and I think that that's a job that he'd be really good at. But the other thing I would say is we've got somebody who's considering running up in Newark. The mayor of Newark, I think, is looking at it. I think he's got a great track record up in Newark, and I think that if he decides that this is something that he wants to consider, I think could really make the race interesting, and I think he could be a great executive if he got in that slot.
Thank you, Jay. Alex?
I never count out Steve Sweeney, but it's going to be Ciattarelli versus Cheryl.
Ciattarelli versus?
Cheryl. Mikey.
Oh, Mikey.
Definitive answer? I give a definitive answer.
Thanks,
Go
Alex.
for it.
Wow, Alex.
Tough questions, tough takes.
Bold predictions. So the only 2 declared candidates in the race right now are Jack Ciattarelli and Steve Fulop. So I'll go with them because it's safe, because they're declared already. I'm making no bets on anything. But pay attention to Josh Gottheimer. He's raised a boatload of money, and he is a prodigious fundraiser. So just keep your eye on him as a Democrat.
As we're now killing time, I guess, before the governor walks in.
I know how that
Anybody else
feels.
want to add more thoughts on 2025?
I want to add a thought on 2024, to be honest with you,
Okay,
since I'm in the
yes, go ahead.
since I'm in the mold of making wild but definitive predictions. I'm going to sound like the football coach again, but I think in 2024, you will either see a rematch, Trump versus Biden. You will either see both of them on the ticket or neither.
Yeah. I
Now,
can see
why
that.
is that? Partially, I'm sure you know, because if one falters, the other party will have an opportunity to say, wait a minute, what are we doing with this old guy? and have an opportunity to go with someone else. President Biden has an absolute dignity-preserving, face-saving way of getting out of the 2024 election. I've got to stop the world from falling apart. If he chooses to step away, he can, and if Nikki Haley or someone else on the Republican side gains some traction against Trump, there will be a growing clamor of voices on the Democratic side for the president to do that. He might not, but the hand of either side will be freer if neither Trump nor Biden is seen to be the front-runner eventual nominee of either party.
I think that's a great prediction, Alex. And I think Gavin Newsom's already running a shadow campaign as we speak, because, you know, as a group of business people, what you want to see is the rest of the country be like California. So anyway, but no, I think you're right about that, and it would be a really interesting dynamic because anything can happen between now and Iowa, which is just a couple months away.
And something that I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on, I think one of the most important dates of the 2024 presidential election cycle is going to happen in January, and it's not going to be Iowa. January 13th is the Taiwanese presidential election, and that is going to be something that, depending on who wins, could create a whole new degree of tension between the US and China. Since China is our strongest geopolitical competitor, they're the pacing threat, they're the challenge for the first half of the 21st century. What happens between Taiwan and China is very, very important for the US, not just politically, but economically, as you all know.
Thank you. Next year, it was referenced the race to replace Congressman Kim, but right now it's 9-3. Democrat Republicans, the split in Congress was 10-2, and Congressman Kaine beat Congressman Malinowski, and so that was the one change last cycle. Do you anticipate not 9-3 staying the same throughout the duration of this map? Do you think any races could be interesting next year on Congress side?
I think you have to start with the fact that we've redistricted. And so what these folks, when the Democrats first sort of swept in, you had several, 4 Democrats win. Well, you had Gottheimer in 16, but then a bunch in 2018. Those districts have largely, for Mikey Sherrill, for Josh Gottheimer, for Andy Kim, have all gotten more Democratic. They've gotten much safer. I mean, Andy Kim basically dumped all of Ocean County. Which is why that was such a startling upset, because it's the reddest county that we have. So in that area, I think it's, we're gonna probably stay at 9-3, but we should all be watching Congressional District 7. I mean, on the way up here, I'm listening to the radio, and on New York Drive Time News Radio, Tom Kaine is already a year out. It wasn't his campaign, so I think it might have been a super PAC that's supporting him. But he's got ads talking about how great he is a year out, because that district, if Trump is at the top of the ticket, that is a district that could be in play. Now, Democrats haven't figured out who they're going to nominate. There could be someone else still, who might show up if they think it's a chance. But that district could be much closer, especially when you have Trump at the top of the ticket there.
And I just want to sorry.
No,
Jeanette.
it's okay.
No, I think
the room. That's right. That's the way to wrap up panel.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for all of you for your great insight
Thank you.
into what we expect from politics.
Thanks, Chris.